Why do we use the word reconciliation to talk about the issues affecting Indigenous peoples in Canada? The word reconciliation means the restoration of friendly relations. So, restoring friendly relations. If you know anything about the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, you might ask, well, what are the friendly relations being restored? When did the Canadian government ever take a friendly approach? Now, you do have a point there, but in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, British authorities officially agreed to establish peaceable agreements with Indigenous peoples, and the British government agreed to protect the sovereignty of Indigenous nations and the peaceable agreements that they would share. The Canadian government has repeatedly confirmed this promise to maintain a peaceable approach in sharing the land with Indigenous nations. So, in theory, and according to documents signed by Canadian governments over the course of history, the governments of Canada have always had a sort of responsibility to maintain peaceful and friendly relations with Indigenous people. Now, maintaining peaceful and friendly relations with one group should involve understanding what is needed in order to support the well-being of that group in question. Now, there's a lot that can be said about how the Canadian government has repeatedly undermined and invalidated this peaceful agreement to maintain friendly relations. And so there's a lot that could be said on that. You could start with residential schools, forcibly displacing Indigenous people from their land, not aiding them in the creation of water treatment plants in areas where Indigenous people don't have access to clean drinking water. There's a lot of things. But the Canadian government has consistently made plans without ever showing any regard for how their plans are going to negatively impact Indigenous communities, and they just simply never showed any concern for that reality and never included how X plan would affect Indigenous communities in their considerations whatsoever. And what's even crazier is that most Canadians literally just know next to nothing about the culture, the values, and the worldviews of any Canadian Indigenous community. Because obviously there are a lot of them. And so nobody knows anything about any specific Indigenous nation, and people may have a vague understanding of some of the beliefs and some of the practices that a number of them share, but there's not much depth to that understanding, and they have no idea how vast the differences can be between the beliefs and the practices and the worldviews of different Indigenous nations. So in my mind, reconciliation should just be about bridging that gap in understanding so that the Indigenous people's perspective just goes from invisible to visible. Because maybe if Canadian people and Canadian politicians understood the Indigenous perspectives at least a little bit, then we could do some sort of rethinking of these political biases that have consistently screwed over Indigenous communities for many years.